Good to see the hometown crowd here. We wander a lot, but we like to get into mischief. And I still do a lot of genre stuff, and one of them is editing MIT's 12 Tomorrows thing. So I'm just going to read the introduction here, which I think describes my kind of philosophy as an editor for this yearly kind of one-off thing. And then I'm going to level with you about what actually happened as opposed to what I state for public consumption here. So, preface. Despite the stark fact that I edited last year's edition of 12 Tomorrows, I got tasked to do it again. This time around, though, I had the benefit of seeing how people reacted to the last one I edited. Pretty gratifying. Even normal people are impressed when you tell them that you're the fiction editor for MIT Technology Review. The most jaded and cynical science fiction writer will sit bolt upright. You can bet that I took full advantage of that situation. This menagerie of stories is one that only MIT Technology Review could possibly assemble and print. I can promise you that no other magazine could have coaxed the design curator of the New York Museum of Modern Art to write a science fiction story. But she did, because she meets a lot of MIT grads in her line of work, and she recognizes their cultural significance as contemporary techno-artistes. So, when Technology Review came knocking, she rolled out a work of speculative fiction that's a corker. Imagine you're a Texan like me, and you're trying to gently persuade some prominent young Britons to come across with some world-class techno-fabulation. Frankly, they tend to get skeptical, even work shy. But not when it's MIT Technology Review. I briskly corralled a swarm of them, including a design fiction expert who wrote us a piece so blazingly weird that even Michael Moorcock's New Worlds magazine would envy it. Not too shabby, as Sir Jonathan Ive likes to say. When you edit MIT Technology Review, your chops are so potent that you can get other editors to write for you. So I persuaded the editor of IO9, the world's best sci-fi culture website, to lay down a text here that's about Mexico. In fact, several of the stories this year are about Mexico, including the story by the one guy in here who is actually from Mexico. He wrote us a work of Mexican ciencia ficción that's set in a future California. If you're from Silicon Valley, you probably need to read that one twice. In conclusion, I'll say a few words about my own story in here. I always wanted to write a story about a guy who owns and uses an Antikythera mechanism, that legendary ancient Greek astronomical computer. Since I'm known for being rather into cyber, that's a Greek word, you know. This prospect has haunted me for my entire career. I never quite knew who my hero was or what he was up to with his anomalous bronze PC. But when I realized that the venue was MIT Technology Review, the muse favored me. Everything clicked, or rather clanked into place. Finally, it's done. It's completed, ready to ship. I hope you enjoy this. Bruce Sterling, Torino, Italy. So, that was the 12 Tomorrows intro as it was written. But the actual copy of 12 Tomorrows only has 11 stories in it. Like, nobody seemed to realize this. It's got, you know, like a Virgil Finlay art thing in the middle, and I like Virgil Finlay as well as the next guy, but like, where's story number 12? And I'm going to tell you about story number 12. So, story number 12 was written, I commissioned it, from a guy who's a Ukrainian warlord. His name's Fedor Berezin. And he was the deputy defense minister of the breakaway rebel People's Republic of Donetsk. So Fedor was a career Soviet military officer in the Nuclear Missile Corps. And then after the USSR broke up, he retired to his hometown of Donetsk in the Ukraine and commenced a second career as a military science fiction writer. So he wrote a long series of military science fiction books, which are all about basically the rebirth of the Cold War and how the Ukraine was going to be taken over by the West and how they would provoke Russia and a Russian-Ukrainian war would break out and the fake peace of the 1990s and the early 2000s would die out and the world would be restored to a new era of polarized military East-West confrontation. So I happened to know about Fedor Berezin because I knew people in Russian fandom. But I was one of the few people who knew about him before the war actually broke out, and he actually became one of the chief kind of conspirators in this shooting war. And so I was following him in social media, where he'd go out every day in his Jeep and take pictures of the Ukrainians shelling the living daylights out of his hometown and so forth. So I thought, you know, this is the kind of science fiction writer who really ought to be in a contemporary mag. I mean, this is the kind of guy that Americans just aren't going to hear from very much. So I wrote to him, and I said, so Fyodor, his original name was Fedor, but when he Russianized himself, he changed his name to Fyodor. So Fyodor, you know, can I commission you to write us an original work for Technology Review? And, you know, I can get some guys to translate it from Russian, and you can say whatever you want, and, you know, you're keen on writing these kind of military speculative works. And I think the American public needs to hear what you have to say from your rebel stronghold in the People's Republic of Donetsk. Like a lot of ex-military guys, a very courtly guy, Captain Berezin, and he's like, are you sure you really want me to do this? Oh yeah, you know, I'm gonna like pay you, and it's gonna be great. It's like, he sent me over a story full of starships. I said, no, I can't print this stuff. I want something that's like more near future, and I was like, do us something. So he wrote me a story called Panama Cataclysm. And I'm going to read parts of Panama. And you know, the guys at MIT thought it was a pretty good story. It's not the best story in here, because, you know, it's about as good as an average Jerry Purnell story. But it's aimed at a similar audience, you know, ex-military, tough guys. So we were all ready to go. I mean, we had the thing proofed and so forth and so on, and then they like sent it to legal. And the legal department at MIT realized the guy is under a NATO financial ban as, you know, basically a terrorist warlord. It's forbidden for anybody in the U.S. financial orbit to directly send any money into Donetsk, and especially the State Department has forbidden anybody to transfer any funds to Fedor Berezin, even though he's no longer the defense minister of the People's Republic of Donetsk. He's just a retired nuclear missile expert still writing sci-fi novels. So we were unable to print it because we were unable to pay him. And I argued we should print it and not pay him. They thought, no, you know, we're going to get sued for having anything to do with the guy who's on the State Department's verboten list. So, you know, he's basically in the same position as Snowden, or, you know, there are over 30,000 people on this, you know, forbidden list. So we haven't paid him because we didn't print it. And I have yet to print his work. And in fact, you're the first audience to see any public performance of this thing. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's over 6,000 words, and it's a bit turgid. But, you know, I'm trying to get it printed, so I'm kind of looking around for people who are like willing to like get it out there. And I'm still in contact with Berezin. He's like, you know, the money's not an issue. I'm a military guy. I've written this for the American public. I think they need to know about the threat of nuclear terrorism. So I'm going to read a few of the pieces from Panama Cataclysm here by Fyodor Berezin, 6,351 words, translated by Andrei Vasiliev and Bruce Sterling. I mean, Andrei put it into something like English, and then I kind of fixed it up a bit. But Fyodor approved all our changes. No. It was a mere microbe, a creature less than an ant which cut the ocean's artery. A creature's physical size cannot determine the scale of its global action. This tiny microbe was not a hospital surgeon or a construction bulldozer. However, he did have a bachelor's degree in business management. Due to his private circumstances, or perhaps a planetary cataclysm fit to drive entire communities of species into extinction, something had gone wrong with this microbe. The microbe was never successful in his university work. The microbe had a problem finding employment. In his stricken region of the world, this was not a unique problem. The general catastrophe blew him around like a straw in the wind until one day he found good fortune in becoming a member of the Group of World Liberation. The GWL were the microbe's dubious acquaintances. They might have recruited him by accident, or maybe because of his useful European appearance. Thanks to plastic surgery, European looks were a market commodity by 2030, expensive for the third world but cheaper elsewhere. How do ordinary men ever become the extraordinary brothers, the liberators? Are men expendable by nature or by the alignment of stars? What do they want, need, and understand, these global world liberation brother liberators? How is it even possible to liberate the world in a period of universal imperialism? Of course, they were terrorists. Before cutting the oceanic artery, the microbe, Foška Đurđić, a Serbian national and a genuine European, took part in several GWL terrorist attacks. Twice, he was the main operative, the bomb carrier. He was not a suicide bomber, nor did he feel suicidal. Bombers of the higher category, those with training and ability, did their work while never entering the impact zones of their deadly toys. Consider the nature of the blast radius. In the first 3 decades of our 21st century, thanks to the comprehensive development of demolition technology, the impact zone of improvised explosive devices, or to be precise, homemade one-man bombs, had increased dramatically. This meant that homemade bombers had to take a special care with safety. Foška Đurđić complied with these rules to the maximum practical extent. He was no man for mere talk. He was proud of surviving the risks of his career, and he liked getting a proper reward for his hard work. Other bombers ground their teeth at the biased media coverage of their mayhem, but this 100% anti-imperialistic temperament helped him get over that. Foška Đurđić was well aware that the authorities always obscured the civilian casualty counts. For instance, consider 4 different 5-story residences suddenly exploding into flames in the wonderful city of Warsaw, Poland. We can ignore certain historical artillery bombardments in which the Red Army liberated Polish resistance warriors, but still, 5 skyscrapers demolished by a truck bomb, and supposedly only 3 people died and several were injured. According to the official Polish reports, let us simply count the personal apartments inside those 5 burning buildings. Well, of course the world has its miracles, but these wars, the information we are given compared to the real world experience with a real stench of corpses, they are deeply intertwined. Which is the origin and which is the stinking sequel? This is no longer clear to anybody. Be that as it may, despite or maybe because of his lack of formal education, the microbe, Foška Đurđić, was excessively self-assured. He should have been skeptical about the reward promised him. Extra zeros come easy to Arabic numerals. A Leviathan battle whale trapped in the broken terrain of the Panama Mountains. Yes, the whale was an aircraft carrier, that pure, that simple. The carrier had dominated land, air, and sea, but now it was marooned and doomed in a waterless environment high above sea level. What could be more embarrassing? This aircraft carrier was named in honor of Fenimore Cooper, the famous American novelist of the 19th century. But the Fenimore Cooper lacked proper heritage. It was among a new class of American aircraft carriers. Due to a stark insufficiency of calculation and navigation data, the Fenimore Cooper was marooned in a range of alien mountains. How could this stranded maritime device roam the world? It was powerful, but did Eurasia have any continental shortcuts like Panama? Even given modern mapping technology with sonars and satellites, did Europe and Asia offer convenient routes from the Gulf of Mexico through Panama or around the Tierra del Fuego? The planet had dark circumstances, damned geopolitical circumstances, problems that the Fenimore Cooper had been built to resolve. We're discussing a military nuclear engine able to cross the 7 seas with no refueling. The intelligent use of time will nip geopolitical problems before they start. Naval aviation squadrons flying above nuclear hotshots in the fullness of time can resolve tricky, unclear situations about detonations. Let us consider a geopolitical naval choke point such as the Drake Passage. What happens if supersonic aircraft over these tight airways are targeted with the massive shockwaves of nuclear explosions? What will be the best military solution? Can hydrogen bombs be tightly connected to a laser targeting ray? Can hydrogen bombs become the tools of precise carpeting of specific streets of some unfortunate megalopolis? Are these military options merely extremely undesirable? Or are they on the scale of a megalopolis? Are they inadmissible? 115 billion US dollars have played their role on the eve of an upcoming global oil crisis, a global oil and gas collapse. The Panama Canal was deepened and the main canal locks were modernized. That expenditure had to be justified. How convenient that this new American aircraft carrier could pass through the harsh mountains of Panama. The improvement of this ocean artery allowed even 1,000-ton naval monsters to ooze through the locks of the Panama Canal, laden with gas and oil. How can a military skeptic fail to believe in destiny? The wheels of fate may grind slowly, but they will grind very fine. What is the fate of the Fenimore Cooper? Instead of promoting stabilization for its mother country, the lost American warship has become an additional pain in the ass to offshore strategic command posts. If they can only bring their stricken warship back to the deep waters of the Atlantic, they might get it out of this situation. And it gets hairier after that. But yeah, and it was interesting to see that, and it's a pity that it did not appear in 12 Tomorrows, because it probably would have been the most disturbing work in there. But no, not because people don't write about nuclear war, because they kind of do all the time. It's just that he's writing about nuclear war in a romantic fashion. And and he's a sufficiently sophisticated guy that he can write for an American audience and basically deliver a long series of polite threats, and do it, and I think in a way which I think did him credit as a futurist visionary. I mean, he's somebody who has expected the troubles that we have, and who was sort of there before they were on the ground, and who aided and abetted them. And now can't get a hearing because we've invented these mechanisms for suppressing terror, and they are suppressing Russian science fiction. It's like the days of the Cold War in many ways. And it's not that good a story. In 5 years, it won't mean anything. It's quite topical. It's provocative, and it's an intervention. It was meant to be an intervention, and it's sort of aimed at us like a harpoon, or at least a flung dart in the ass. But I don't really see any other method by which MIT Technology Review could have dealt with this. I mean, they were happy to give the guy his say. It was never like a First Amendment issue. It really was the machinations of the State Department and these mechanisms to just shut down payment. It was really the author's intellectual property rights problems. It's like, we can't pay him, so we can't print it. And that was the reason that his work didn't appear, right? Even though he would have been happy to give the work away, and in fact told me now that I should try to print it anywhere I can, and he will gladly forfeit any payment. I don't think he gets a lot of payment anyway.
50 years ago, you'd have had trouble getting payment of any kind for a science fiction.
Well, yeah, I used to get messages from Yugoslav saying, yeah, your book has won a literary award here in Yugoslavia, and of course they hadn't paid us anything, because they were the Yugoslav pirated several of my books, and now I live in Belgrade, and I'm married to an ex-Yugoslav. And if you're aware of literature in combat zones or former combat zones, and I very much am, there's nothing surprising about this. It's merely that it's a contretemps, and as an editor, it's really frustrating. And it casts something of a shadow over the other accomplishments in here. I really did get unusual people to write remarkable things. And, you know, and we said nothing about it in the actual publication. We didn't say, oh, you know, and he actually is a warlord. I don't doubt he's responsible, directly responsible for the deaths of many people. And you know, the war in Ukraine is quite nasty. It's worse in many ways than anything like Slovenia went through. And they sure threw a lot of bombs. I mean, if you're into studying explosives firsthand, as Fyodor obviously is, he's seen a great many. I mean, they really have. These guys are like motorcycle gangsters with 200 millimeter howitzers. There weren't many straight ahead gunfights. They would just sort of like send out drones or use satellite photos and then just like launch artillery barrages from over the horizon and just kind of blast the opponent off the map. So there, you know, a million refugees are in UNHCR camps, or they're in Russia, or they fled to. I know people there. We've been to Kiev. We were in Kiev after the revolution. I mean, I don't want to boast that we get directly into trouble. I'm not a war correspondent, but it's been a fascinating thing to study. You know, I'm always interested in other people's science fiction. And this is an area where science fiction has been very influential. And a lot of the guys in this militia were like huge fans of the Strugatsky brothers. They're all major league fans of the new Hard to Be a God movie, if you've seen the Strugatsky thing. They're former Russian special forces guys, the little green men and so forth. A lot of them are sci-fi fans, and even more of them are like steampunks. They're way, way into historical dress-up kind of stuff.
It's all part of the same nostalgia that's eating its way through.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's like Laughter of Carthage, you know, these kind of, or the Russian guy, Colonel Pyatt in Laughter of Carthage. They're like Colonel Pyatt, these kind of, you know, lost guys from the ex-military. None of them are in the Russian military. They're all, you know, heavy-duty, darkly cynical, capable men who, you know, they've been hired by moguls or, you know, backed up by political parties. And, I mean, Putin definitely wanted Crimea. He just needed Crimea because it had a naval base there. But nobody gave a damn about the Donbass, about, you know, about Lugansk, about Donetsk. Nobody's ever heard of those places, and for good reasons. They're godforsaken, into the earth, Appalachian coal mining camp kind of areas. But these guys walked in there and just grabbed shitloads of stuff at gunpoint, and they're not giving it back. And now the population is completely polarized because everybody's blown the living daylights out of everybody else's universities and elementary schools. So they just, you know, it's a frozen conflict. I mean, they just stopped shooting. And the West has stopped complaining. Even the Germans haven't raised a peep in a while. So I'm quite interested in what happens to my colleague, Captain Berezin. And he's very much a sci-fi guy. I mean, he happens to be a military guy, but he's not much different from, you know, a lot of American right-wing military guys I know.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, he's a typical kind of ex-military guy who, you know, he's writing techno-thrillers, right? It's just that the guy bit off more than he could chew. He had a techno-thriller downtown, you know, but I don't think he regrets any of it. I think he's, you know, he's a Russian nationalist, or Soviet nationalist, or, you know, current Russian nationalist, and I think he's all gung-ho for invading Syria, you know, blowing up ISIS, shooting terrorists, imposing an iron hand throughout the Caucasus, intimidating Finland, subverting the Baltic guys, you know, like, and he's one of the sort of thinking figures who like works this stuff out and kind of like dreams about it, puts it down on paper, and kind of like, you know, gives it an air of sci-fi razzle-dazzle and kind of justifies it avant la lettre. And he's not monstrous. I mean, I hung out in Russia a lot. I mean, during the calm, you know, they're like, I mean, they are who they are. They're Slavs, you know. There's periods when we're like really worried about them, and there are periods when they're like Uncle Joe, you know. It's like, if there's somebody worse, we like them. Like Hitler's around and Russians are great, you know.
Usually if they go anywhere at all, they've got there because they've got a certain charm. I mean,
they're very charming people, you know. They're very warm-hearted. They'll like ask you into their homes. They'll like make you soup. They'll like, you know, shelter you, they'll do you all kinds of favors. You know, I'm quite the Slavophile. I don't have many illusions about them. I don't think they have a better way of life, because men my age are all dead.
It's pretty much identical to Texas, isn't it? I mean, it shouldn't be a big...
No, well, no.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like a Kulak culture. No.
Well, not really. I mean, people make that. They make that comparison, and I understand it because they're like really trigger happy, and we're like sort of big, and there's like big steps, and you know, there's been like blood slaughter in Texas, and it's one of the few areas in North America where white guys were subjected to ethnic cleansing. So you know, yeah, it's a dark and bloody ground around here, but they don't really have the Slavic temperament of like Nichevo. You know, I mean, Texans don't believe life is hard. Texans are like into Southern Gothic. You know, I mean, they're overconfident, bragging kind of guys, and Russians are very kind of self-involved, gloomy characters. You know, and also, you know, people around Texas, the nearest neighbors, are not terrified of Texans, whereas everybody around Russia is like really, really worried about them, and like, you know, frets about them all the time, with the possible exception of Serbia, where they like to get Russian money and sell it to the West. I mean, they're in business to be an entrepot, so they kind of make nice to Russians. But they're not really much like us Texans. I mean, no, they really have kind of a unique historical temperament. Turks are a little bit like Russians, actually. You know, a defeated imperial people who are sort of hate and despise everybody around them and sort of imagine they have the solutions and then can't actually govern themselves. You know, a people of deep soul and large political tragedies. Yeah. So it's a pity I couldn't print his work. I don't know what I'll do if I'm asked to do it again. I'm surprised they asked me to do 2 of them in a row.
I'll help you do it if you want to do it.
That's very kind of you. That would be great.
So I could publish it in English.
Yeah, well, publishing it in England would be fine, but also you wouldn't be able to give the guy any money out of Britain, I don't think. Unless you sent it through China first, that might be nice.
Alibaba.
Alibaba. You want to like launder some money through, the newly found love for the Red regime in Beijing. That would be awesome. I don't know. I mean, it could be a week later and things would be fine, and we could like ask him over to Austin and take him out for a chicken fried steak. I've seen weirder shit happen. Just like something really bad could happen. People could forget all about the Ukraine. I mean, World War III could break out in the Mideast. The U.S. and the Russians could be allies again in a week and a half. It's not. No, you never know. But it would be kind of irrelevant at this point. I mean, I'm more likely to show up in his hometown than he is to show up in mine. And I would go. I knew people in Donetsk. I mean, all the people I knew from Donetsk were emigres that had been blown out of town or else purged by the new regime, but they were perfectly decent guys. They're all like coders, guys from Maker Labs, website managers. They look just like you. Bespectacled, literate white people. Not that much difference, but boy, did they ever wander into a self-made hornet's nest. Oh yes, I had my say, and I appreciate your offer of help. In fact, if any of you know or have good advice as to what I should do with this particular hot potato, I'd be happy to know about it. If you want to read it, you can send me an email. I'll just like send you a copy of the story. It's pretty good. I mean, it's not the best thing ever. I mean, like reading stories that are subtle threats of one-man nuclear terrorism against American geopolitical interests.
He's not too bad about that. I mean, he's pretty good at doing it.
Yeah, he's done a lot. He's quite a capable guy. I can see why he's popular. He has this mix of menace and elaborate sarcasm.
Well, nobody expected he was ever going to be anything 15 years ago. I mean, nobody expected anything of it. Sorry.
Well, no, I'm happy to know. It's just I don't know what's going to happen to these guys in 15 years, but they're definitely a bellwether area. I mean, if you knew that trouble was coming there, you knew there was going to be big trouble. I'm actually a bit more surprised at how the conflict seems to be ending. And it just literally just sort of stopped. And there's none of the combatants seem to have any major interest in reviving. The Ukrainians don't have any stomach for the fight. The Nets guys they've got basically nothing. The Russians are a lot more interested in blowing up Syrians than they are in blowing up their fellow Slavs at the moment. The U.S. is head deep in it, but none of the candidates are going and yelling out, "We got to go avenge the Ukraine." I mean, it's not, nobody's asked anything to any of the, it's not an issue in the Congress. It was for a while, but it's just everybody sort of agreed to let the thing die and fall off the edge of the table. I don't know. I mean, it seemed to work in Cyprus.
Well,
Yeah, just don't say anything about it. I mean, they're the last divided capital in Europe, and I've been there. Set a part of a novel there once. It's still a divided capital since 1974. There's towns in Cyprus that have been behind barbed wire since 1974. Nobody goes in where it does anything. Completely deserted, gigantic overgrown orange groves, houses just eaten by their lawns. Nothing touched, pastel seaside, creepy, weird area, you know, like neutron bomb hit those places. Really worth a look. I'm rambling, but you know, I ramble. but you know, I think there's a logic in frozen conflicts. And, you know, this is a hot war that's become a frozen conflict, and it's just kind of interesting because it's right on the fringe of NATO. And you know, the mere fact that nobody's shooting doesn't mean that like unsavory elements aren't gathering strength there. Because there's shitloads of like westernized, I don't even know what to call them, you know, Blackwater types, operators. The European right is gathering kind of a Lafayette escadrille of anti-Russian guys. There's money around to pay them. They like bang bang. They're, you know, unquiet spirits. They're into women, guns, narcotics, shooting. Guns, a lot of guns. They're very into guns. You know, a lot of money in guns. Oil, there's a lot of oil in that area. There's coal, there's a lot of coal. They're not rich, because nobody who sells coal is rich, but they're not devoid of resources. There's a lot of wheat. There's a lot of people that you can sort of basically oppress, enslave, or exploit.
It's probably the bottom line of all of it. A lot of people.
Yeah, lots, and it's big.
I mean, generally, it's
Ukraine's
just too many
Texan
people.
size. You know, you could go into one of these areas and just buy yourself some abandoned fortress or castle and just live like Dracula for decades. I mean, nobody would touch you, nobody would investigate. You could smuggle people, hide stuff, do all weird Aum Shinrikyo style pet microwave backyard laser rubbish. If you wanted to write a convincing, you know, horror techno thriller, kind of a Dr. No thing, you know, that would be a place to have it, not some sunny Caribbean island where Ian Fleming used to hang out. One of these unpoliced and untaxed zones where everybody's on the take and everybody's got a gun, and whoever's got the private militia just kind of like sets up as a robber baron. That's 2015 for you, brother. Real deal. And although some of these other stories are quite dark, there were none quite as dark as that in its origins. So.
You want to tell a little bit about some of the other stories in the anthology?
Well, you know, I think you ought to read them. I could talk a little bit about the people and sort of why I decided to put them in here. You know, I had to ask John Kessel because he's like one of my oldest friends, and I've respected his work quite a lot. So he wrote a very nice piece, and I got Pepe Rojo to write something. He's a guy from Tijuana, literary professor, who's done a lot of Mexican kind of ciencia ficción stuff, and he's on quite cordial terms with us here in Austin. He's been through a number of times, Pepe. He's like a part of Tijuana narco cultura. So Chris and I were hanging out in Pepe's house, and he was telling us about the militia cops raiding his place looking for God only knows what. And he's a font of weird stories, and he's written quite a weird story. And then there's Nick Harkaway, he's kind of a cunning guy. He's the son of John le Carré. You may not know that, but John le Carré, the British thriller novelist, and Nick Harkaway is his son, and instead of writing thrillers, the guy feels a need to write sci-fi, and you know, it's pretty darn good. And then there's Alona Gaynor, who's a graduate of the Royal College of Art. She does a lot of design fiction. So Alona likes to do designs about situations that don't really happen, like she designed a bank robbery at one point. And, you know, I know people at the RCA because I hang out with the design crowd a lot, and she's kind of a star character in that scene and seems to write a lot for a designer. So I'm like, why don't you actually write some science fiction instead of making up all this speculative design stuff? That was kind of interesting. And then there's Ned Bowman, he's quite a cunning guy. He's written a number of novels, The Teleportation Accident, Glow. William Gibson thinks very well of Ned Bowman. He's kind of a stylish guy, quite, you know. He's not Gibsonian, he's not like a Gibson disciple, but if you like Gibson, you probably understand why he likes reading Ned Bowman. And there's Annalee Newitz, who edits IO9. She used to work for Wired. I knew her. I used to work for Wired. I like IO9 quite a lot. You should see. Yeah, she seemed to me to have good taste, but nobody ever asked her to write fiction. So she wrote some fiction that's basically about a woman who runs a website. It's pretty good, right? It's like actually rather amusing. You know, and then there's Charles Stross, who's like, you know, this cyberpunk novelist after the letter instead of before it. And Daniel Suarez, who writes a lot of technology stuff. He's like a technical guy out of California, who's had some hits with his kind of, you know, computer fiction. This thing he wrote, I thought, was one of his better works. And then there's a guy named Joe Lindsay Walton, who's not to be confused with the much more famous Joe Walton. I was, you know, looking up Joe Walton on the web, and I stumbled over this Joe Lindsay Walton guy, and he just seemed really interesting. He's like a weird, cranky poet, and I'm like, what's the worst that could happen? I'm going to get him to write something. So, you know, yeah, I mean, he's a weird, cranky British poet. What are you going to do? I didn't get Ian Sinclair. Maybe next time. We've got to have one weird, cranky British poet in every issue. So yeah, that was it. I don't know. You know, and I could probably do this once a year, you know, kind of forever in a day. But it's not like, I mean, editing a magazine once a year is not like editing an actual science fiction magazine, because you don't really have like a continuous kind of line of advancement to work. You can't sort of say this is like our way to do it. And, you know, I like stories about drives, you know, or quantum physics, you know, psi power is real, you know, whatever.
You can't bring people on.
Yeah, well, you know, you have you need a stable, and you need like a tone of what's going on. So, you know, my thing going on here reads more like your, you know, literature and translation thing over there. It's like they're all really interesting, or they would have been translated into English, but they wouldn't really have a whole lot to say to one another. Yeah, kind of like, so, what's your story? Well, you know, I'm a Mexican novelist, and I have my work translated in English. It's like, the Americans really think I'm great. It's like, now how about you? I'm a Polish guy, and the Americans think I'm great too. Will the Polish guy read the Mexican guy? No. No, the Polish guy won't read the Mexican guy. Even if the Americans go to their house and knock on the door like, you guys ever read this Polish guy? I'm from Mexico. What the fuck do I care about Polish? I've seen it happen a million times. I mean, Brian Aldiss has seen this happen. He like started World SF, the organization. Like, we're all science fiction writers. Let's all gather in a room and talk about this. Okay, the Finnish guys have nothing to say to the Malaysian guys.
Well, apparently Harry Harrison was one of the people who started the World Science Fiction. He said they only started it so they could get free trips to various foreign countries, particularly young countries.
Well, you know, I do a ton of that myself, you know, and I understand Harry's, you know, justification totally. You know, when he and Brian used to do these sort of very well-meaning kind of, you know, let's listen to the Malaysians kind of things going on. You know, and Brian famously told me once, he said, you know, there are like way too many science fiction writers who want to write about Mars, but they wouldn't know what to do if they were in Malaysia. And Brian was in Malaysia, because he was like in the war in Malaysia.
he was
And I've been to
saved by
Malaysia.
the
Oh, go to fucking Malaysia. You know, go to Malaysia at the drop of a hat. During the confrontation, I mean, yeah, I mean, he's lucky not to like die of jungle fever in Burma or whatever. But, you know, I didn't get sent to Malaysia, but I take his point. You know, you have to like actually be willing to go there. And I am willing to go there, but the further point is that the Malaysians don't really want to go talk to the Finns. And that's like the missing piece of the puzzle. I mean, why isn't everybody really interested in Morazen's problem? He's like the most dangerous and probably the most troubled science fiction novelist in the world. You could tell that to Locust and they'd be like, why would that be on the cover? I don't get it. How many units has he shipped through the Dolphins? Scarcely one. So, you know, there's kind of there's a missing politics there. I mean, it's a literary community, but it's not a political community. It's not a military community. It's not, you know, a geopolitical community. And I don't know. I mean, it seems a little weird to me. I mean, for a long time, I wanted to write a regional novel about the planet Earth. That would be like kind of a necessary thing to do. Write a regional novel about a planet. But I think like the moment at which that would have been the right thing to do is gone, because we're actually entering an era of cultural disintegration. And even within states, there's like bitter polarization. We've been kind of gerrymandered. So it's very difficult to make kind of globalizing universalist statements, even on the page, and, you know, write something that would mean something to Malaysians and Finns. And I've never found a method to do that. I found methods to like say things that mean something to Mexicans. Like, you know, I wrote a story from Chris's, you know, Mexican science fiction anthology. I wrote the, you know, I wrote the introduction to Chris's Mexican science, an original fiction for a Mexican science fiction anthology. And my new book, which I can't help but boast about, is a collection of Italian science fiction stories, which are all in Italian and only in an Italian translation. So I've got a book called Utopia Pirata, which is 7 Italian fantascienza stories, which is packaged by Urania Books from Mondadori, exactly as if I were an Italian fantascienza writer. You know, Bruno Argento instead of being Bruce Sterling. You know, and it has no English language edition. There's no intent for it to be an English language edition. It's really the kind of book I would have written had I been an Italian science fiction writer. And every story in it is written from that point of view. It's all for Italians. It's about their issues, it's about their history. The Americans never get a look in, right? And, you know, so I think that's like a cool kind of card deck trick. You know, it's as if Mike here were to start writing Western novels, which I know he's done, but, you know, as if you were to write Western novels and nobody was supposed to know that you were from Britain, that would be even better. You know? Rename yourself Henry Blodgett, do a bunch of Zane Grey knockoffs. But it has the additional thing of, you know, the language barrier. So it's more as if you were to be writing, you know, Mexican novels, pretending to be a Spanish writing surrealist guy, whatever. You know, and they're not even pastiche. And it's hard to say what they are, because they don't imitate any Italian science fiction writer in particular. They're not like Valerio Evangelisti, you know, Ligia Troisi. I mean, some of them are vaguely Calvino-like, but not in any way that Calvino would understand. They're just kind of there as like weird artifacts. You know, and that's the kind of thing I find genuinely interesting. It's just kind of, I don't know.
I think you could write
Yeah.
novel, but you had to concentrate entirely on domestic issues.
Yeah. No, there's a Serbian writer who does some sort of like that, Zoran Živković.
Yeah.
He's written a bunch of books, some of them are translated into the U.S. You know,
yeah.
and you know, in Živković books, it's like it's always entirely domestic, and they're all set in Belgrade, but the city's never named. And the people are never named either. Stuff like he got up in the morning, he had a bowl of cereal, his wife was looking unhappy, he scratched himself, a UFO appeared, But, they have this kind of weird, universalist thing because they're just set on this kind of pre-political.
Well, they were actually just in the straight tradition, that tradition of unnamed rather than fantastic. It's just.
Well, I think you might be able to write a globalistic novel that's just about guys who are like internet backpackers, kind of daily carry minimalist guys, sort of living out of a laptop kind of guys. They're like, okay, I'm like a Bitcoin guy, and I don't care where I'm showing. In fact, I don't even want to be there. And like I'm in Phuket, and then I'm in Canberra, and then I'm like hanging out in, whatever. Okay, but that's a very tiny class of people, and their interests aren't really global. I mean, I know a lot of them because I'm like always running into them. But that kind of, and they're a genuine globalistic class, right? Commonly they're married to foreigners, they're kind of multilingual guys, educated in very different areas. And they're kind of troubleshooters wherever they're going, and some of them don't even have homes. I mean, it's like famous European billionaire publishers, famous for having no home. They're just on Twitter. They're just like, weird thing, really weird thing, strange premonitory thing, other weird thing, bizarre kind of, and I'm like, I stream them, so I'm like able to like scratch that itch. And there are people who follow that, there are people who like write me and say, when you're really active on Twitter, I get very frightened. They're really, they're scared that something untoward is going to happen to them, not that I'm like writing something scary. I don't really get a lot of fan mail from people saying, your work really terrified me. People say it's like disconcerting or, peculiar or. But the Twitter stream actually does frighten people because it's kind of this unadorned sort of, it's like reading Lovecraft's commonplace book. A lot scarier. Than Lovecraft's I had Lovecraft's commonplace book on my desk for many years. Now I've got an electronic copy of it. But I recommend it very highly. I think it's a great work of, science fictional ideation.
Well, Alan Moore's turning it into a comic book.
I don't doubt it. Have a lot of respect for Alan. Yeah, he's a serious crank. Really.
Well, what he says is he thinks he can turn that into what we turn science fiction into.
I would like to do something with it myself. I've been known to write the occasional Lovecraft pastiche. Well, you wouldn't want to write like Lovecraft. You just want to sort of like do something.
I'm having trouble reading Alan's comics.
I wouldn't want to do a comic. I would want to do something.
Well, no, I can't read
something that was about Lovecraft's commonplace book. I'm friendly toward this kind of, Oulipo, non-literary kind of paraliterary forms of expression. I don't have a problem with that. My problems are sort of like, why would you read this? Who is the audience? What good is it supposed to do to the audience? And just, you want to avoid the kind of science fiction vice of card tricks in the dark where you've done something super clever only nobody's ever going to figure it out. Right?
So on the subject of regional or maybe regionalist authors of foreign language that people in America maybe don't care anything about, that don't necessarily get translated into English right away. There was just a recent, like on the 20th of this month, I think, I remember because it was my dog's birthday, Michel de Welbeck's most recent novel got translated into English. And
he's a big Lovecraft fan, Welbeck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any reaction to his science fiction or
I wrote a story actually for Swedish Pen, of Writers League up there, in which a bunch of people are hanging out in a Parisian cafe reading Houellebecq books. and Mari Dariussec, who's like the other, kind of weird current French writer, writes, kind of speculative literary fabulism, and like women turn into pigs in her books kind of thing. So, Wellebeck wrote this recent book called Submission, which is about like a future Muslimized France. And of course the French came completely out of their skins about it, because he's like pressing right onto the, sore spots of the National Front and so forth. And, people in the French power structure take this guy really seriously for some reason. It's like France's first lady likes to compose songs named after his novels and so forth. So, I really liked Wellebeck's essay on Lovecraft, although I don't think he understood Lovecraft very well. So, as a theorist, I'm kind of in Wellebeck's camp. I'm kind of like digging what he has to say about writing. I'm not sufficiently engaged in French politics to really care what he does to them. But, he's the kind of guy who could easily end up as like Minister of Culture someday. Jean-Jacques Servan Schmidt. Yeah, and there's like a million of them. And, and in some ways it's humiliating to be an American writer and be reading one of these guys and suddenly realizing, hey, literature actually means more to him than it does to us. It's not like trying to capture eyeballs on the airport rack. On the contrary, it's like actually angling for major cultural figure status. And it's, it's especially humiliating when he's writing an entire book that's about basically nothing except sitting in a small French village drinking tea and complaining. And somehow this is like a major achievement on his part. I don't know. I read a lot of foreign writers. I tend to read more of them than I do, classic science fiction novels these days. Just because they seem weirder. I read them and there's like stuff going on there I don't get.
I think they're fresher, Bruce.
Yeah, well, they're fresher to me because I just read heaps of sci-fi.
They're not coming out of the genre in quite the same way. They're probably having to create and invent more. Just before.
Well, I'm just such a hard-boiled pro that it's rare for me to read a work of commercial science fiction and be surprised by anything that's going on there. I can appreciate the craftsmanship or whatever, but I'm not going to be like, whoa, it's like, what the hell? Okay, unless they're like really young, or unless they're 40. I can read like Bolano, like, okay, what the hell is this Chilean guy on about? Anyway. Yeah, we're overstaying our time here, I'm reckoning.
No, well, thank you so much, but it's been great, Bruce and Jasmina. Thank you so much for coming, and
it's good to get these things off our chests.
Yes, and we'd love to have you come back and talk some more and chat, and we're really excited about having our bookstore here, and it looks like a bunch of new faces I haven't seen, and thank you a bunch for coming. Thanks.
That's great.
Please eat food. We have lots of cookies, we have lots of hummus, and we also have books.
I have books.
And the Finns do talk to the ladies. I know. We need to adjourn. They don't like each other.